The morning Hazel Birch buried her mother, the bank sent a man to take the house. She hadn't finished washing the dirt from her hands when he knocked. Polite knock, too. 3 taps, like he was visiting a neighbor for tea. She opened the door, still holding the rag she'd used to wipe the shovel handle, and he handed her papers the way people hand you things they don't want to touch for long. Her mother had borrowed against the property twice. Once when the harvest failed, once when the cough started, and the doctor wouldn't come without payment up front. The total came to $430. A number that meant nothing and everything at the same time. Hazel looked at the papers, then at the man, then at the house behind her. The one her grandmother had built with her own hands in the bush outside Pemberton. The one with the crooked window in the east bedroom, and the floorboard that sang when you stepped on it wrong. The man said she had until Friday. It was Wednesday. She'd heard about the notice posted at the general store in town. A rancher up north near Harwick Lake was looking for a housekeeper. Live-in, year contract, renewable, room, board, and $12 a month. No experience required, the notice said. Capable woman preferred. She didn't know what capable meant to a man she'd never met. She figured she was about to find out. The wagon to Harwick Lake took 2 days. She rode the first part with a mail carrier who didn't speak much, which suited her fine. She had nothing to say, that wasn't grief, and grief wasn't conversation. The second part she walked, 4 miles on a road that got narrower and muddier the further north she went, carrying everything she owned in a canvas bag her mother had packed years ago for a trip they never took. The ranch came into view around a bend in the tree line. She stopped walking and just looked at it for a moment. It was bigger than she'd expected. Main house, 2 stories, timber and stone, set back from a cleared yard with a barn and 2 outbuildings. Beyond that, pasture running toward a line of spruce so dark they looked almost black in the late afternoon light. Harwick Lake glinted silver at the far edge of the property, flat and cold and still. The place could have been beautiful. Instead, it looked exhausted. The fence along the road leaned like it had given up arguing with the wind. The barn had a gap in its siding where boards had come loose and nobody had nailed them back. The yard between the house and the outbuildings was churned mud and old straw, as though the work of the place happened everywhere except where it was supposed to. Hazel picked up her bag and kept walking. Nobody answered the first knock. She tried again. The door opened on a boy of about 10, with dark hair that needed cutting and boots that didn't match. 1 brown, 1 black, both too big. He stared at her the way children stare at things they haven't decided about yet. She said she was there about the housekeeper position. He said his father wasn't home. She said she'd wait. He looked at her bag, then at her face, then stepped back from the door without quite inviting her in, which she decided to count as good enough. She went in. The kitchen was the first thing she saw, and it told her everything she needed to know about the last several months of this house's life. Dishes in the basin, some of them from what looked like more than 1 meal ago. A pot on the stove with something dried hard to the bottom. Flour on the table that nobody had wiped up. Not filth exactly, more like a place where someone had been trying and losing, a little more each week, until trying didn't look much different from not trying. The boy's name was Ned. He told her that without being asked, sitting across from her at the table while she looked around the kitchen and calculated how long it would take to put it right. He had a sister, he said, younger by 2 years. Her name was Polly. She was shy. Hazel said that was fine. She asked if there was coffee. He found her some. It was terrible coffee, too strong and too old, but she drank it without complaining because complaining had never fixed anything in her experience. She was on her 2nd cup when she heard boots on the porch. The man who came through the door was not what she'd imagined. She'd built a picture in her head on the walk-up, filling in the shape of someone who posted notices like his in general stores. Probably older, probably rough in the way of men who'd worked land. So long they'd started to resemble it, someone tired in a visible way. He was tired. That part was right. But he was younger than she'd expected, somewhere in his late 30s, broad through the shoulders with a face that had been weathered rather than aged, like wood left out a season too long. A scar along his jaw, healed old and pale. Eyes the color of the lake she'd seen coming in, gray with something darker underneath. His name was Graham Lorne. He looked at her sitting at his table and said, "You're the one from the notice." "Yes." He said her name was? She told him, Hazel Birch, 24 years old, from Pemberton. She could cook, clean, manage a household, keep accounts if needed. She'd helped run her mother's farm since she was 12. He didn't ask why she needed the work. She appreciated that. He said the contract was a year. He said the children needed supervision before and after school. He said there was a room off the kitchen, small but with a window. He said $12 a month was what he could manage right now, and if that changed, he'd tell her. She said that was fine. He said the last woman had lasted 6 weeks. She asked what happened. He looked at Ned, who had been listening to all of this from his chair, pretending not to. Graham said they could discuss the details later. Ned said, "We made it hard for her." Graham's jaw tightened. Ned looked at the table. Hazel looked at the boy, at the set of his chin, the same angle as his father's, the same stillness that wasn't quite calm, and thought, this is a child who learned to fight because fighting was the only thing that felt like doing something. She understood that. She'd spent 3 years fighting a cough that eventually won. She said she wasn't easy to run off. Ned looked up. She said she didn't have anywhere else to go, which was the truth. And truth had a way of landing different than bravery did. Graham said she could start Monday. She asked if she could start now. There was a pause. He looked at the kitchen the way a person looks at something they've stopped seeing because seeing it hurts. Then he nodded. She found the youngest child an hour later. Polly was 8, small for it, with her father's gray eyes and a serious face that had forgotten what it used to do before it got serious. She was sitting in the narrow space between the woodbox and the wall in the kitchen, reading a book with a torn cover. She looked up when Hazel came to get kindling and didn't say anything. Hazel said hello. Polly said nothing. Hazel got the kindling and started the stove properly for the first time in what smelled like weeks. Polly watched. Hazel said the stove had a draft problem, probably a blocked flue. She said she'd need someone to show her where the tools were kept if she was going to fix it. Polly said the tools were in the lean-to behind the barn. Hazel said thank you. Polly went back to her book. It wasn't friendship. But it wasn't war either, and Hazel had learned the difference mattered. The first week was work. Just work, no conversation, no warmth. She didn't expect any. She cleaned the kitchen top to bottom, which took 2 full days because the grime wasn't laziness so much as grief, the kind that settles into corners when people stop noticing corners. She fixed the stove flue. She scrubbed the floors and found they were good wood underneath, pine gone dark from years of boots but solid. She organized the pantry and took stock of what they had and what they'd need before the next supply run. Graham came in for meals and went out again without much comment. He worked dawn to dusk, sometimes later, with the 2 ranch hands who lived in a cabin at the edge of the property. A quiet older man everyone called Tuck, and a young one from down east named Perry who laughed too loud and meant well. They ran cattle, mostly, and some timber on the north edge of the land, enough to keep the place alive if nothing went wrong. Things had been going wrong. Hazel noticed it the way she noticed everything, quietly by paying attention to what people didn't say. Graham came in from the north pasture on her 5th day, with a look on his face that had no good in it. He didn't say what had happened. He ate supper in 4 minutes flat and went back out. Tuck came in later for coffee and let slip that they'd found another section of fence down and 11 head of cattle gone. 11, Hazel said. Tuck said it was the 3rd time this season. She asked if it was the same fence line. He gave her a look, not unfriendly, just surprised. The look people give when they've decided someone is decoration, and then discover the decoration has opinions. He said yes, same stretch of the east boundary. She said that seemed like more than bad luck. He said Mr. Lorne thought so too. But thinking so and proving so were different things. She asked who owned the land to the east. His expression shifted. He said that was a fellow named Douglas Schofield. The name was in the file of used names. But she'd heard it from Tuck before she remembered that, and the way he said it, flat, like he was setting something heavy down, told her enough. She asked what his interest was in Lorne's cattle. Tuck said his interest was in Lorne's land. Had been for 3 years. Made 2 offers since Graham's wife died, both for less than the place was worth, both politely declined. 3rd offer 6 months ago hadn't been so polite. Hazel thought about that for a long time after Tuck left. She thought about it while she washed the supper dishes, and while she put Polly to bed, and while she sat at the kitchen table afterward with Graham's account book, which she'd found under a pile of mail and asked permission to look at. He'd said yes the way a drowning man says yes to a rope, not because he trusted the rope, just because he was out of other options. The book was a problem, not falsified, not negligent. He'd kept it faithfully. She could see that, the numbers written in a careful hand that cost him something to produce. But careful record-keeping couldn't fix what she was seeing. 3 years of slow decline. Losses that clustered around the same weeks Graham spent away on the supply runs or timber assessments. Too consistent to be coincidence. She wrote her findings in the margin in pencil because she didn't want to presume. Then she closed the book and left it where he'd find it. He found it the next morning. She was starting breakfast when she heard him come down the stairs, heard the paper of the book, heard him stop. He stood in the doorway of the kitchen for a moment. She kept her back to him and turned the bacon. He said, "You wrote in my book." She said she'd written in pencil and it would rub out. He said, what did she think she was looking at? She turned around. She told him, 3 years of theft with a clear pattern. She told him who she thought was doing it and why. She told him she didn't have proof, but she knew what a pattern looked like. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she started to wonder if she'd overstepped, if she'd made herself the kind of help that causes problems instead of solving them. Then he sat down at the table. He rubbed his face with both hands. He said, "I knew something was wrong. I couldn't make myself look at it long enough to see what." She set a plate in front of him. She said she understood that. He looked up at her. She said grief made it hard to look at things straight on. You had to come at it sideways, from a direction that didn't remind you of what you'd lost. She'd learned that with her mother's accounts. Couldn't open the book for 6 weeks. Then she looked at it 2 in the morning when she was too tired to feel anything, and she saw it clear. Graham was quiet again, different quiet this time. Not closed, just thinking. He said his wife had kept the books. Hazel said he didn't have to tell her that. He said her name was Lydia. She'd died 3 years ago, November. Fever that came fast and went nowhere. The children were 7 and 5. She said she was sorry. He said everyone was sorry. He said it the same way she'd once thought when the bank man came, politely, flatly. The way you say things you've said too many times. She sat down across from him with her own coffee. She said she could keep the accounts if he'd let her. Not to replace what Lydia had done. Just to keep them current, so he could see what he was dealing with instead of just feeling it in his gut. He said he'd think about it. She didn't push. 3 days later, he put the account book on the kitchen table, without comment, and went outside. She picked it up and got to work. Ned's resistance had been quiet and methodical in the way of children who've learned that loud resistance gets you nowhere. Missing spoons when Hazel needed them. A door left open in the cold. Small sabotages that wouldn't be called sabotages if anyone asked. Just accidents, just forgetfulness. She didn't call them anything. She replaced the spoons. She closed the door. She went about her work with the same pace she'd used at home in Pemberton when everything needed doing, and the only question was what to start with. It was the 3rd week when something shifted. She wasn't sure what caused it. Maybe nothing specific, maybe just enough time wearing through. Ned came into the kitchen while she was mending the hem of Polly's school dress, and he stood there for a while doing nothing, which was how he usually started a conversation. Finally, he said his mother used to do that. Hazel said lots of women mended hems. He said his mother did it differently. She did it at the table with the lamp pulled close, and she hummed when she worked. Hazel said, what did she hum? He didn't know the name of it. He went and got Polly, who had a better memory for that sort of thing. Polly said it was something she'd heard at church in town. She couldn't remember the name either, only the sound. Hazel said she probably didn't know it then. Her mother had hummed when she worked too, but different songs. Polly sat down at the table across from her and watched her work. After a while, she said her mother would have been 33 this April. Hazel set down the dress and looked at the girl, this serious, too old face, these gray eyes too full of knowing. She said 33 was no age at all. Polly said no, it wasn't. They sat together in the kitchen while the lamp burned, and the wind moved through the spruce trees outside, and neither of them said anything else, because sometimes that's the right amount. The cattle losses continued. 2 more head gone off the east fence line while Graham was in town getting the children's winter boots resoled. He came back to find Tuck waiting in the yard with a face like a storm front, and Hazel watched from the kitchen window as the 2 of them walked out toward the east pasture. Graham's stride getting shorter and harder with each step the way it did when he was furious and trying not to be. That night after the children were in bed, Hazel put the account book on the table and sat down. Graham came in from outside, poured himself coffee, and stood by the window. She said she'd found something. He turned. She had mapped the dates. Every loss since 3 years ago. Cattle, a missing timber contract, a load of firewood that disappeared from the yard, and laid them beside the dates Graham had been away from the property. 14 instances over 33 months. 14 times, not once had the losses occurred when he was home. She pushed the paper across the table. He read it standing up, which told her he'd already suspected and was bracing for confirmation. He set the paper down. He said, Schofield's been at this longer than I thought. She said it looked that way. He said he couldn't prove it. She said not yet. He looked at her. She looked back. She said she had an idea, but he wasn't going to like the first part. He said, tell me anyway. She said, let it be known in town that Lorne's ranch was in serious trouble, that Graham was considering selling, that the place was maybe too much for one man to hold together. Let that story get back to Schofield and see what he did with it. Graham's expression went flat and hard in a way she'd learned meant he was keeping something in, not putting it out. He said that story wasn't far from true. She said she knew. He said he didn't want his children hearing it. She said she'd make sure they didn't. He stood there with his coffee and the weight of the thing, and she waited, because she'd learned in 3 weeks that Graham Lorne came to decisions on his own schedule and pressure didn't help him, just made him go quieter. Finally, he said, "All right." She went to town 2 days later with Tuck, who knew enough people at the hardware store and the post office to let things slip in the right ears. She played her part simply. A tired woman working for a man who was maybe going to have to give it up. Such a shame. He'd put so much into that place after his wife died. She didn't oversell it. Overselling was for people who'd never watched a real story grow. A real story just needed watering and it spread on its own. On the ride back, Tuck said, "You're a cooler hand than I expected." She said she'd been managing bad situations her whole life. She'd just never had a plan before. He almost smiled. Graham made a good hire. She didn't answer because it wasn't really a response she had for that. What she hadn't expected was Polly. It was the same week as the trip to town. Hazel came upstairs to call the children for supper and found Polly in her room. Not snooping. Just sitting on the edge of the bed with Hazel's canvas bag on her lap. Not opened, just held. The way you hold something that belongs to someone you're trying to understand. Hazel stood in the doorway. Polly looked up and said, "I'm sorry, I didn't open it." Hazel said she knew. She sat down beside her. Polly set the bag between them. Polly said, "Did you have a family before this?" She said yes. A mother and a farm and a house with a crooked window. Polly said what happened to them. She said her mother died in March. The farm went to the bank. Polly said, "So you didn't have anywhere to go?" Hazel said that was true. Polly said, "That's what happened to us when Mama died. We didn't have anywhere to go either, except here, and here got smaller." Hazel looked at this child, this 8-year-old, who talked like someone who'd been carrying things since before she had the shoulders for it. She said she thought she understood that. Polly said, "Is it going to get better?" She didn't say yes because she didn't know. She didn't say maybe because maybe was the sound of someone buying time. She said, "If I have anything to do with it, yes. And I usually have something to do with things." Polly looked at her with those gray lake-colored eyes and seemed to be deciding something. Then she said, "Ned likes you more than he lets on." She said she'd noticed. Polly said, "I like you more than I've said." She said she'd noticed that too. Polly got up and went downstairs for supper without another word, but she sat next to Hazel at the table, which she hadn't done before. The trap worked the way traps do when you've read the animal right, slowly, and then all at once. 2 weeks after the story went around town, a man showed up at the gate on a Tuesday afternoon. Hazel was in the yard with a basket of laundry and she watched him ride up. Expensive horse, clean coat, the kind of clean that means the person wearing it has never had to worry about keeping things clean. He introduced himself as Douglas Schofield, which she already knew, and he asked to speak with Graham Lorne. Graham was in the south pasture. She said she'd pass along the message. Schofield looked at her in the way men look at women they've decided are furniture. He said he heard the ranch was having difficulties. She said all ranches had difficulties. He said he might be interested in making an offer. He said he'd done business with the previous owner. He said it like that. Previous owner, like Graham was already past tense, and he knew the land well. She said she'd let Graham know. He rode away and she stood in the yard holding the laundry basket, watching him go, and felt something cold and deliberate settle into her chest. Not anger. Anger was hot and spent itself. This was something more useful. That night she told Graham everything Schofield had said, word for word. Graham's face was very still. She said he'd used the words previous owner. Graham said, "He's already decided this is over." She said only if they let him. He looked at her across the table. The children were in bed. The lamp between them made his face look older and younger at the same time, the way firelight does to people you've started to see clearly. He said, "Hazel." She said yes. He said, "I don't know how you ended up here, but I'm glad you did." She said she was starting to think she might be too. He said that wasn't what he meant, or it was, but it wasn't all. He said she'd done more in 6 weeks than he'd been able to do in 3 years. Not because he was useless, because he'd been underwater. He said his wife used to tell him he couldn't see things clearly when he was drowning. He'd told her he wasn't the drowning kind. Hazel said she suspected Lydia had been right. He almost laughed. It wasn't a full laugh, just the shape of one, but it changed his face in a way she hadn't seen before. He said Lydia had usually been right. She said she'd heard that was often the case with the kind of women who kept account books. He said yes. He said she had been that kind. There was a silence between them that wasn't uncomfortable. Those silences had started appearing more lately, the kind that come when two people have stopped needing to fill the space with words and can just be in a room together. She said she wanted to take the account book to the land office in Harwick and ask some questions about the property boundaries. She thought there might be something in the registration records worth knowing. He said she didn't need to do that. She said she knew, she wanted to. He said why. She looked at him across the lamp and thought about how to say it plainly. She said this place had started to matter to her. The kids, the work, the way the light came across the lake in the morning. She said she didn't have anything of her own left, and she wasn't about to watch someone take the only thing she'd found worth keeping. Graham was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "It's yours as much as mine, whatever we find out." She said that was a generous thing to say. He said he meant it. She believed him. What she found at the land office was a boundary dispute, 3 years old and never resolved, between the Lorne property and Schofield's eastern acreage. A clerk with tired eyes and ink on his cuffs walked her through it without being asked, because she'd come in with the account book and her notes, and she'd asked the right questions in the right order, and people who did that tended to get answers. The east fence line where the cattle kept disappearing was the contested boundary. Schofield had filed a claim asserting the true line sat 40 feet further west, meaning the pasture where Lorne's cattle grazed would technically be Schofield's. It was a thin claim, the clerk said, not well supported by the original survey, but it was filed and it was there and a judge hadn't ruled on it. The cattle that vanished weren't being stolen outright, or not only that. They were being moved to pasture that Schofield intended to prove was legally his, then quietly absorbed into his own herd. Hazel sat with that information for a moment in the land office chair. Then she asked the clerk for a copy of the original survey. He said that would take a few days to prepare. She said she'd come back Friday. She came back Friday. She rode back to the ranch with the survey rolled in her bag and the feeling of something clicking into place. The same feeling she'd had when she'd first looked at the account book at 2 in the morning. Not triumph exactly, more like the relief of knowing what you're actually dealing with. Graham was on the porch when she rode in, which wasn't usual. He'd been watching for her. She dismounted and handed him the reins and started talking before they got to the door, because she didn't want to lose the thread. She spread the papers on the kitchen table and showed him the original survey, the filed claim, the dates of the cattle losses mapped against what Schofield would need to demonstrate to win a boundary ruling. Regular presence of his cattle on the contested land, no interference from Lorne's herd. Graham read it without speaking. She said, "He's not just stealing from you. He's building a legal case with your own cattle." Graham sat down slowly in the kitchen chair. He looked at the papers for a long time. Then he said, "I would never have caught this." She said he would have eventually. He said, "No, I wouldn't have known what to look for." She said that was what she was here for. He looked up at her. Something in his face had shifted, not broken, not softened exactly. More like something that had been held too tight for too long had let go just slightly, just enough to breathe. He said, "This is more than what I hired you for." She said she knew. He said, "Why are you doing it?" She thought about Polly sitting with her bag on the bed. She thought about Ned with his mismatched boots who was starting to say good morning when she came downstairs. She thought about the lake in the morning and the way this house had started to feel less like somewhere she'd landed and more like somewhere she'd arrived. She said, because if Schofield wins this, the kids lose their home, and they've lost enough. Graham was quiet. Then he said, "So have you." She didn't answer because it was true, and she didn't have anything to add to true. He said, "We take this to the land office and we contest the claim." She said they'd need a lawyer and witnesses who could testify to the actual fence line history. He said Tuck had been on this land for 15 years. He knew every post on the east boundary. She said Tuck was a good start. They rode into Harwick together the following Monday. Graham, Hazel, and Tuck, who sat on his horse with the solemnity of a man who'd been waiting to say something for a long time, and was relieved to finally be saying it. The lawyer was a woman named Emmeline Farr, which Hazel liked immediately, who listened to everything they brought and asked 3 precise questions, and then said she thought they had a strong case. She said Schofield had made one mistake. He'd filed his boundary claim 3 months after the losses started, not before. If the losses were intended to build evidence for the claim, the timeline made his plan visible. Hazel said she'd noticed that in the dates. Emmeline looked at her over the top of the papers. "Who did the accounting on this?" Graham said she did. Emmeline said, "Good. I may call you to testify." Hazel said that was fine. Schofield received the legal notice on a Thursday. By Saturday, his man had ridden to the Lorne property and asked to speak with Graham. Graham came out to the gate and didn't invite him in. The man said his employer wanted to resolve this quietly. Graham said there was nothing quiet to resolve. The man said Mr. Schofield was prepared to drop the boundary claim in exchange for Graham withdrawing the fraud complaint. Graham said no. The man said his employer could make things difficult. Graham said things had been difficult for 3 years and he was used to it. He said the fraud complaint was going forward. He said if Schofield's men came on his land again for any reason, he'd treat it accordingly. The man rode away. Graham came back to the house and sat at the kitchen table and let out a breath that sounded like 3 years of something. Hazel set coffee in front of him. He said, Lydia used to say some things only end when you stop waiting for them to end politely. She sat down across from him. She said Lydia sounded like she'd known what she was talking about. He said she usually had. There was a pause. Then he said, You're not like her. She said she knew. He said, I don't mean that as a criticism. I mean, he stopped. He looked at his coffee. She was warmer, quicker to laugh. The kids got that from her, or they used to. Hazel said nothing. He said, You're different. You go very quiet, and then you've already figured something out, and the rest of us are still catching up. She said her mother had said she was hard to read. He said, I don't think you're hard to read. I think most people aren't patient enough to pay attention. That was the closest he'd come to saying something plainly, and she let it sit in the room without picking it up or putting it away. Just let it be there between them. The children had stopped being a war. It had happened without announcement, the way most things in that house happened, gradually and then all at once, without anyone deciding to do it. Ned started staying at the table after supper, talking, not a lot, but enough. He told her about school, about a boy named Arvid who had a dog that could open latches, about how he wanted to learn to work the timberline with Tuck when he was old enough. Hazel listened the way she'd listened to her mother in the last months, fully, knowing it mattered that she listened. Polly had started helping in the kitchen, not because she was told to. She'd just appear at Hazel's elbow one afternoon and start doing things. Peeling potatoes, setting the table, folding the laundry with a seriousness that made Hazel want to laugh and cry at the same time. Once Hazel asked her why she was doing it, and Polly looked at her and said because it needed doing and she knew how. Hazel had said, exactly right. Polly had looked pleased in the small, careful way she allowed herself to look pleased. The hearing at the land office was set for December, which gave Schofield 2 months to decide what to do with himself. He spent them doing what men like him did when they couldn't fight forward. He applied pressure sideways. Word went around Harwick that Lorne's ranch was in legal trouble, that the accounts were disputed, that Graham had hired someone to do his books who'd gotten him into a mess he couldn't get out of. The last part was directed at her specifically. She heard it from Tuck, who heard it at the feed store. She said it was a predictable move. Tuck said it might work. People talked. She said people always talked. The question was what they said after the talking. She went to the harvest meeting at the Harwick Community Hall the following week, the one where the ranchers and farmers around the lake came together to talk about the season and what they'd need going into winter. Graham went with her. They sat at the long table with their neighbors, and Hazel listened. And when the conversation turned to fence line disputes and boundary records, which it always did eventually in a room full of people with adjacent land, she told them what she'd found. Not all of it, just enough. She showed 2 of the nearest ranchers. A couple named Burke and a third-generation farmer called Meredith, whose family had been on the lake since before Hazel was born, the survey and the timeline. She showed them the pattern. Burke said he'd had 3 steers go missing the previous spring. Meredith said she'd had feed disappear from her south barn twice in 1 month. Hazel asked if they'd documented it. They hadn't, but they remembered the dates. She said that was enough to start. By the time the meeting ended, 5 neighbors had come to her with their own stories. Not all of them connected, but enough of them close enough to the Lorne property, close enough to Schofield's land, close enough in time to the disputed cattle losses, that a picture was assembling itself out of pieces people had been carrying separately for years. On the ride home, Graham said, "How did you know to do that?" She said she hadn't planned it. She just listened. He said, "You always know what to listen for." She said her mother had told her that listening was the skill most people decided they didn't need. He said it seemed like her mother had known a few things. She said she had. She said she missed her every day. He said, "I'm sorry she died." She said, "Thank you." He said, "I mean it. Not the polite kind of sorry. I know what it's like to lose the person who knew you best." She looked at the dark road ahead of them, the trees black against the gray sky, the horse's breath misting in the cold air. She said, "The worst part is when something happens, something good or something hard, and your first thought is still to tell them. And then you remember." He said, "Yes, that's exactly the worst part." They rode the rest of the way without speaking, but it was the kind of silence that comes from understanding, not absence. The hearing took 3 hours. Emmeline Farr presented the survey, the timeline, the testimony from Tuck and 3 of the neighboring ranchers. Schofield's lawyer was expensive and confident in the way of lawyers who've won by spending more than the other side. He argued that the cattle losses were exaggerated, that the timeline was coincidental, that Graham Lorne's records were maintained by someone who'd been on the property for less than 3 months and couldn't be considered reliable. Emmeline called Hazel to the stand. She sat in the chair in the Harwick land office, and the lawyer looked at her the way Schofield had looked at her in the yard. Like furniture, like something to be set aside. He asked how long she'd kept the accounts. She said since September. He asked what her qualifications were. She said she'd managed her mother's farm accounts for 8 years, since she was 16. He asked if she had any formal training. She said no. He asked how she could expect the court to accept financial records kept by someone with no formal qualifications. She said the same way any court accepted testimony, by looking at whether it was accurate. She said she'd like him to find a single error in the records she'd presented. She said she'd brought all of them and she'd wait. There was a pause in the room. The land registrar, a careful man named Havelock who'd been doing this work for 20 years, asked to see the records again. He spent 12 minutes looking through them. Then he said he couldn't find an error either. Schofield's lawyer moved on. He asked why, if she was only a housekeeper, she'd taken such an interest in the legal affairs of the property. She said she didn't consider it legal affairs. She said it was arithmetic and attention, and somebody had to do it. He said, wasn't it unusual for a housekeeper to take such an active role? She said she didn't know what usual looked like, since she'd only done it once. Registrar Havelock made a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. The ruling came the following week, in writing, delivered to the ranch by a courier who arrived at breakfast time and handed Graham the envelope with the gravity of someone delivering news they don't know, is good or bad. Hazel was at the stove. Ned and Polly were at the table. Graham opened the envelope, standing at the door, and read it, and she watched his face. His face did something she hadn't seen it do before. It went still, and then it went open, and it stayed that way for a moment, unguarded, undefended, the face of a man who'd been holding something so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to put it down. He looked at her. The boundary claim was dismissed. Schofield had 30 days to remove any livestock from the contested pasture. A separate investigation into the cattle losses was being referred to the district sheriff. Polly said, "Is it good?" Graham said yes. Ned said, "Did we win?" Graham said, "Hazel won." She turned back to the stove because she didn't know what her face was doing, and she needed a moment. Ned said, "Hazel, you won." She said she'd heard. Polly said, "That means we're staying?" Graham said, "That means we're staying." And then Polly, who had been careful and measured and precise about every feeling she'd allowed herself for the past 3 months, said, "Good," in a voice so full of relief it was almost a different word entirely. The evening after the letter came, Graham asked her to walk with him to the lake. It was cold, November cold, the kind that gets into your coat before you've buttoned it, the kind that makes the spruce trees stand still and the water go the color of iron. They walked through the yard and through the pasture gate and down to the shore, and they stood there for a moment looking out at the water. He said, "Your contract's up in April." She said she knew. He said, "I'd like you to stay." She said she could likely extend the contract, if the terms were reasonable. He said, "I'm not asking you to extend the contract." She looked at him. He looked at the lake. He was not a man who looked at things directly when they mattered. She'd learned that about him. He looked sideways, at the edge of things, and spoke from there. He said, "I've been thinking about what you said, about having something worth keeping." She said yes. He said, "I'd like to be that, if you thought you could manage it." She looked at his profile against the gray water and the dark trees, and she thought about everything that had brought her here. Her mother's debt, the bankman's knock, the notice on the wall of the general store, the canvas bag, the 2-day ride, the kitchen full of accumulated loss. She thought about Polly's voice saying Mama used to hum. She thought about Ned and his mismatched boots and the way he now said her name in the morning like it was something that belonged to him. She said, "I'm not Lydia," he said. "I know," she said, "and I'm not easy. I'll keep the accounts and I'll keep my opinion, and I won't stop doing either of those things because someone finds it unusual." He said, "I know that too." She said, "You should know what you're agreeing to." He turned to look at her then, directly, which was not his usual way. He said, "Hazel, I watched you testify in front of a land registrar and make one of the most expensive lawyers in the district look like he'd forgotten how to read. I think I know what I'm agreeing to." She said, "All right then." He said, "Yes." She said, "Yes." He didn't say anything else. He wasn't a man for speeches. He reached over and took her hand the way he'd once helped her down from the wagon the first night she arrived. Carefully, like something worth not breaking. And they stood there by Harwick Lake in the November cold, while the water went dark and the first stars came up through the clouds. They married in March, before the contract ran out, at the small church in Harwick on a Saturday morning, when the snow was just starting to think about melting. It wasn't a large gathering. Tuck and Perry from the ranch, Emmeline Farr, a few of the neighboring families who'd come to the hearing, and felt they'd earned a stake in how it ended. Polly wore the dress Hazel had mended in the fall she'd asked to. She'd come to Hazel 3 days before the wedding, very serious, and said she wanted to wear it, and she wanted to know if that was all right. Hazel had said of course it was. Polly had said, I know you're not Mama. Hazel had said she knew. Polly said, but you're something. You're something we didn't have before. Hazel said she didn't know what to call that. Polly said, we don't have to call it anything. It can just be what it is. Ned, for his part, had been characteristically practical about the whole thing. The morning of the wedding he came downstairs with his hair actually combed and both boots matching, the same color, the right size, clearly borrowed from somewhere, and stood at the kitchen door while Hazel finished braiding her hair. He said, I'm glad you didn't leave in October. She said why October specifically. He said that was when he hit her good knife. She said she'd noticed. He said, I know, you just kept working. She said there'd been work to do. He said, that's why I stopped. She looked at him in his borrowed boots with his combed hair, this 10-year-old who'd learned to love things by watching what he couldn't drive away. She said, ready? He said yes. They walked to the church together, all four of them, through the mud and the almost spring light, and Graham held her hand the whole way, with the certainty of someone who'd made a decision and wasn't going to question it. The years that followed were not simple. Frontier life didn't offer simple. The Schofield investigation took another 8 months to resolve, and when it did, it came with fines and a civil suit and the kind of slow legal unwinding that cost money and attention even when you were winning. 2 bad winters in a row hit the cattle hard. The North Timber contract fell through one spring and had to be renegotiated at a loss. But the accounts balanced. Hazel kept them, every month, every quarter, every year, in the same careful hand she'd used on her mother's books in Pemberton. She knew the land the way you know a place you've earned. She knew the east fence line. She knew which pastures flooded in spring and which held dry. She knew the name of every animal and the history of every debt and the particular sound the north barn made before the wind shifted. She knew, too, the particular sound Graham made when he was worried and the particular sound Ned made when he was pretending not to be excited and the small, careful way Polly allowed herself to be happy. The children grew. Ned started working the timberline at 14 as he'd wanted, and was better at it than most men twice his age, which surprised everyone except Hazel. Polly, at 12, was keeping a secondary set of accounts for the egg and butter sales. Hazel had started the previous year, doing it with the same precision her mother apparently once had for the main books, and doing it without being asked. Graham saw that one evening and stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment. Hazel was washing dishes. She watched his face in the lamp reflection on the window. He said, she's like Lydia. She said yes. He said, she's like you too. Hazel said, she'll be better than both of us. He came up behind her and put his hands on her shoulders, and they stood there watching Polly work at the table, very serious, her pen moving in steady lines across the ledger. On a morning 2 springs after the wedding, Hazel stood on the porch before the house was awake and looked out at the lake. The light was coming up low and gold across the water, and the spruce trees were dark against it, and the yard was quiet except for the sound of the barn, and the particular silence that sits in a place before it wakes. She thought about the general store in Harwick, the notice on the wall, capable woman preferred. She'd been terrified when she walked in to read it. Not of the work was the least of it. She'd been terrified of what it meant. That her life had narrowed to a posted notice and a canvas bag and 4 miles of mud, that everything she'd had was behind her, that the only direction was forward into something she couldn't see. She'd been right to be terrified, and she'd been wrong about what the terrifying thing meant. Graham came out behind her, 2 cups of coffee, and stood beside her without speaking, because that was how they'd learned to start mornings together, in the quiet before the day required them. She said, I thought I was going to the end of something when I came here. He said, you told me once you thought your life was over when the bank came. She said, both times I was wrong. He said, you've been wrong about a few things. She said, a few. He handed her the coffee. She took it and looked out at the lake going bright in the morning light. Her lake, her land, her people sleeping in the house behind her, and felt the particular kind of peace that doesn't come from nothing going wrong, but from knowing you can handle it when it does. She'd arrived here with a canvas bag and a mother's grief and nowhere else to go. She'd built something out of that. Not instead of what she'd lost, but alongside it. A life that held the loss without being only the loss. The frontier didn't give you that. You took it. You worked for it. You stayed when leaving would have been easier. Hazel Lorne had stayed. And every morning she stood on this porch and looked at this lake, she understood a little more clearly that staying had been the bravest thing she'd ever done. Braver than the land office, braver than the testimony, braver than any of it. She'd had nowhere to go, and then she'd built somewhere worth staying.